Hi everyone, and welcome to today's art lesson based around some drawing techniques that we'll need to use as we move forward with our lessons. So today we're going to look at shading and tone, and in this lesson we're going to explore the use of shading and tone in drawing. It's a very important skill that you're going to need to practice if you wish to improve your drawing outcomes. All artists use shading and tone in their work, and some of the best use this so effectively that you can't tell the difference between their drawings and the photographs they've drawn from, or the objects they've drawn from in life. Now we're going to get prepared, and there's a few things that you're going to need. Firstly, you're going to need some drawing materials. Now that can either be one pencil, which is a HB or below, so say for example a 2B, or if you've got a range of pencils like a sketching set that goes maybe from an 8B all the way through to an H pencil, then you can use that as well. You're also going to need a paper or a sketchbook. You're going to need an eraser and a sharpener. You're going to need a suitable space to work in, so make sure you've got plenty of space to draw. You should use a clear table or a hard surface that's got lots of room around you. And you're going to need a clear view of this video because some of the objects that we'll be drawing will appear on the screen. So make sure that you can see this clearly. Today's lesson objectives, I've split up into two. And firstly, the first lesson objective is going to be to learn about shading and tone and how to apply it effectively in our own pencil drawings. And then secondly, as always, we're going to critically analyze our outcomes and reflect upon our drawings by suggesting some improvements. Remember, to successfully achieve these objectives, then you've got to think carefully about your drawing. Make sure you pay close attention to the demonstration in this video and the success criteria that I will go through. This is very important for your annotation at the end. Now we're going to look at what is shading and tone. And for this, I'm going to ask you to answer the following questions. Firstly, what is shading and tone? What do you think that it is? How do we use it? Why do we use it? What effect do you think it creates? And how would this improve your drawing? You can pause the video here and have a go at answering these questions. When you finish them, you can resume the video. Now that you've had a look at those questions and had a go at answering them, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about how we can use pencil grades and tonal scales to achieve effective shading and tone. There are a range of pencils we can use from soft to hard, and each has a different tone on paper, and you can see these where you can see at the top 2B, 3B, 4B and so on, and then the 6H, the 5H and the various pencil grades that you can get. And beneath that you can see a tonal scale, which is from dark to light, and that's done with one pencil, but you could do that using a range of the pencils above. So the soft pencils, which are our top line, they are easier to apply and remove, and that's because the graphite inside them is softer, so it's smoother to lay on the paper, it smudges more easily, but it also rubs out easily as well. The hard pencils are lighter, which are the ones on the second row, but they're much more difficult to remove or blend, and that's because the lead inside them, or the graphite inside them, is hard, which means that it sort of indents the paper and it's got a more permanent effect. Now to practice this, we can use a tonal scale, which you can see at the bottom. And you can do this, as I said, with a range of pencils, starting with an 8B as the darkest, all the way up through the scale until you get to a lighter or almost white part of the paper. Or you can do this with one pencil, and then you would press harder for the darker sections, and you would get lighter with your pressure as you move across until you go to the white. The next task I want you to do with whatever materials you have, so that's either the one pencil or a range of sketching pencils if you've got them, is to have a go at creating your own tonal scale. This doesn't have to be very big, but it's a nice way for you to practice before we move on. So you can pause the video here and have a go at creating your own tonal scale. When you're done, make sure you press play on the video and we will carry on. Now that you've actually finished your tonal scale, I wonder if you can see how that applies to this drawing. And this drawing is a very good example of how we can use shading and tone to create a 3D object. And there are a few things that I'd like to point out on here. Firstly, the highlights. The highlights of a drawing are the lightest part in the drawing, almost white or even white, just the paper. And then you've got the light tones. And the lighter tones are those ones that are quite bright, but they're not as bright as the highlight. The mid-tones speak for themselves. They're the middle tones. They're not shadows and they're not highlights. They're somewhere in between. And then your dark tones, which are your shadows or the darkest areas of your object. Now on this one, there's a reflection as well, and you might see this in the objects you draw later. And that reflection, even though it's in the darkest area, is a slight bit of a highlight which actually points out the shape. Because if that highlight was coloured in the same colour as the shadow, then you wouldn't get the shape of the ball. There's always a light source, and for this one it's coming from the top right hand corner, and you can tell that because the highlight is the lightest part of the object. That is where the light hits first, and that is where the brightest area is. And through shading and tone, which is one of the things I really want you to focus on today, is creating this illusion of an outline. You can't see a solid circle outline around this. What you can see, especially where this arrow is pointing out, is a difference between the light and the dark tone. And that creates the illusion of an outline without actually drawing it. So for our lighter tones and maybe some of our mid-tones, we may decide to use a hard pencil and a soft pencil then for our darker tones, as the soft pencils are the darkest shades. And then when we look at the bottom, we've got a cast shadow, and for realistic drawings or believable objects, we always need a shadow, and that also comes from the light source. We can see the light comes from the top right hand corner. If it comes down in a straight line, then you can see how the shadow is cast. So now that we've gone through that, I'm just going to revisit the first part that we talked about and the 5 questions. So what is shading and tone? Well, I'm sure you've got your own answer for that. I would say that it is a way of applying light and dark areas to a drawing to create a realistic outcome, or to create a tonal outcome that makes objects look three-dimensional. How do we use it? Well, we've got a range. We could either apply different pressures to get dark and light toned, or we could use soft and hard pencils. And we use it by looking at where the light is coming from and picking out our highlights and shadows. Why do we use it? Well, that's kind of covered in the first part, but we use it to add more depth to our drawing. And what effect does it create? Well, it creates that three-dimensional effect, that realistic, deep drawing. And how would you use it in your drawings? Well, especially in your drawings, you need to show that you can use these different skills and that you can use a range of techniques and processes. We've looked before at mark making. Well, this is a different type. This time we're not really looking at marks. We're looking at blending our pencils and working very carefully over the top. Now we're going to come on to today's task, and that task is to develop our shading and tonal skills using only pencil. We're going to draw from a simplistic image to practice, and then we're going to get the depth and tone correct with that without using these bold outlines. So even though you start with an outline, the idea is that it's very, very light, and by the time you finish, you shouldn't be able to see that outline. There should only be the illusion that I talked about in that image earlier. So here's a really good example from the Drawing Academy, which you can find on YouTube. And this is showing how they develop an observational drawing of an apple using shading and tone. It's only really with one pencil, so they're pressing harder and softer depending on whether they want dark and light. And they're looking very carefully at the shadows. And you'll notice that the outline they use slowly starts to get rubbed out as the video progresses. And then as that goes on, there is no outline apart from the illusion between the dark and the light. Right, so now that you've watched that video, you can probably pick out your own success criteria of what we're really looking for here. And the first thing is accuracy. Now, if you can say, I have worked slowly, carefully, and lightly to create an accurate outline of the subject, making sure that I've looked closely at the object, then you'll be doing well. Now, you can say then that you cannot see the line in the finished piece, and if you've done that, then it shows that you've effectively applied your shading and tone. And then the second part, depth and tone. So I have layered my pencil to create a range of tones from dark to light, making sure the shadows and the highlights are in the correct place. And as you can see from that video, it takes a long time to build this up and you need to look carefully. You can use a rubber even to start to add in some of the highlights if you do them a little bit too dark at the beginning. And then I have looked carefully at the lighting of how the lighting affects the object, and then that I've shown this by using the highlights and using shading and tone to create effective shadows. And that's very, very important if you want to create a realistic looking object. And for this task, this is a 15-minute task, so don't spend any longer. There'll be a timer for it. This is just a practice. Now, using this image that you can see and using your knowledge about shading and tone, I'd like you to create a 15-minute sketch of the apple in front of you. So you've already seen a similar process in the demonstration. There's a few things you want to remember before we do this. Use a range of dark and light tones. Use a light outline which disappears. And think about the overall shadows and highlights to try and make this believable. I'm going to leave this up on the screen and I'm going to start the timer now. You've got 15 minutes. Good luck. Right, now that you've finished your little practice run, now is the main challenge. And this is a 1-hour task, and I'm going to ask you to pause the video for this one. You can now choose an object that you would like to draw. Make sure there's something a little bit more complex than an apple. So for example, it could be a games console controller or a bag with pockets and zips. So you're looking for a few little extra things in a bit more detail. If you want a challenge, then you can choose more than one object. When you've chosen your object or object, you need to create an accurate drawing using your shading and tonal skills. This will take at least an hour to do, and you can spend a bit more if you want to, but what you really need to remember is that you look closely at the object you're drawing from, especially where the light is hitting it and where the shadows are around it. Now you've got 1 hour. As I said, you can use a little more if you want to. If you pause the video here and then come back when you've completed the task. Great, so I'm assuming now that you've completed your own challenge and that you've picked the objects you want. Now this is difficult for me to see. Obviously this is an asynchronous lesson. It's pre-recorded, so I can't see exactly what you've done. In order for you to tell me about that, especially when you come back to school, I would now like you to write a little reflective paragraph discussing what you've done, so what objects you've included, how you've approached this drawing, what techniques you've used, what worked well in that drawing, and how could you improve. And make sure these are full sentences and that you really discuss the things that you've done. And you can go back to earlier on in this video and look at some of the things I pointed out, and you can add that to your evaluation. When it comes to improving, don't be too critical. Just make sure you set yourself at least one target. If you did this honestly again, how could you make it a little bit better?